They told him it was impossible. $1,000 on the table said that old man in the faded red jacket couldn't get that rusted Deuce and a half running. Not in an hour, not in a day, maybe not ever. The young mechanics laughed as he shuffled toward the abandoned military truck, his white beard catching the morning light. 4 minutes later, that engine roared to life like thunder, and every face in that garage turned white as snow. If you believe some things are worth more than money, if you understand that real skill never fades, stay with this story. His name was William, though most people just walked past him without asking. 70 years old, white hair and beard framing a face that carried decades of quiet sorrow, always wearing that same red jacket over a plain shirt. He lived alone in a small apartment 3 blocks from the Veterans Hall, spending his days mostly in silence. People saw an old man. They didn't see the Marine Corps mechanic who'd kept entire motor pools running in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. They didn't see the hands that had rebuilt engines under enemy fire, that had coaxed life from machines everyone else had given up on. William never talked about those years. The memory sat heavy behind his sad, serious eyes, and he'd learned long ago that most people didn't really want to hear about them anyway. The garage belonged to Marcus Chen, a third-generation mechanic who'd inherited the business from his grandfather. Marcus was good at his work, confident, maybe a little too confident. He'd built a reputation in town for tackling difficult jobs, for being the guy who could fix anything. His crew of younger mechanics looked up to him, fed off his energy and his certainty. When the call came in about the old military truck, Marcus had driven out to see it with 2 of his guys. The Deuce and a half sat behind an abandoned National Guard armory, covered in rust and bird droppings, tires flat, windows broken. It had been sitting there for at least 15 years, maybe longer. The new property owner wanted it gone, wanted to know if it could be restored or if he should just have it scrapped. Marcus walked around the truck shaking his head. He'd worked on plenty of old vehicles, but this was something else. The engine was seized. He was almost certain. The fuel system would be completely gummed up. The electrical system was probably shot. Even if you could get it running, the cost would be astronomical. He told the property owner it wasn't worth it, that he should sell it for scrap metal. But the owner was stubborn. His father had served in the Guard, had driven trucks just like this one. He wanted to see it run one more time before he let it go. He'd pay whatever it took. That's when Marcus made his mistake. Back at the garage telling the story to his crew, he got a little too cocky. One of the younger guys asked if anybody could get that old beast running. Marcus laughed, said maybe some old-timer who'd actually worked on them back in the day, but those guys were all gone or too old to turn a wrench anymore. He said he'd bet $1,000 nobody in this town could get that engine started in under a day, not without towing it to a shop and doing a complete teardown first. The bet was loud enough that other people heard it. Word travels fast in small towns. William heard about it 3 days later at the Veterans Hall. He'd stopped in for coffee, sitting alone at a corner table like he always did, when 2 younger vets sat down nearby talking about the challenge. $1,000 to get an old Deuce and a half running. Some hotshot mechanic saying it couldn't be done. William's hands tightened around his coffee cup. He knew that truck. He'd walked past it dozens of times on his morning walks. He'd stopped once, put his hand on the hood, felt the familiar lines of the vehicle he'd spent years of his life maintaining. A Deuce and a half, an M35. He'd rebuilt engines on those trucks in the field with nothing but basic tools and determination. He'd kept them running through sandstorms and monsoons, through mechanical failures that should have been impossible to fix. He didn't say anything that day. He went home, sat in his small apartment, stared at his hands. These hands that shook sometimes now, that ached in the cold, that people assumed couldn't do much of anything anymore. He thought about that truck sitting there, abandoned, disrespected. He thought about some young mechanic who'd never served a day saying it couldn't be done. And something in William's chest, something that had been quiet for too long, started to burn. The next morning, William walked into Marcus Chen's garage. He stood there in his red jacket, his sad eyes taking in the pristine workspace, the modern equipment, the young faces that turned to look at him with barely concealed impatience. Marcus came over, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression polite but dismissive. Could he help with something? William's voice was soft, almost hard to hear over the radio playing in the background. He'd heard about the bet, about the truck. He'd like to try. Marcus actually laughed. No offense, but this wasn't a job for someone his age. The truck was completely dead. It would take specialized equipment, a full team, probably weeks of work. William just stood there, his expression unchanged. He asked again, quietly, could he try? Marcus looked at his crew. A couple of them were smirking, one was openly grinning. Marcus shrugged. Sure, why not? If the old man wanted to embarrass himself, that was his business, but the bet stood. $1,000 if he could get it started. And just to make it interesting, just to make sure this didn't drag on all day, he'd give him 1 hour, 60 minutes. If that engine wasn't running by then, he'd owe Marcus $100 for wasting his time. William nodded slowly. He asked for one thing, his old tool bag from home. Marcus agreed to drive him to get it, still smiling, already thinking about how he'd tell this story later. They drove in Marcus's truck, William silent in the passenger seat, Marcus making small talk that went mostly unanswered. At William's apartment, the old man disappeared inside and came back carrying a battered canvas bag that looked like it had survived a war. Because it had. Multiple wars. The tools inside were old, some of them vintage military issue, maintained with a care that bordered on reverence. Marcus glanced at the bag and said nothing, but something in his smile faded slightly. They drove to the armory in silence. The Deuce and a half looked even worse up close. Rust covered every surface. The tyres were rotted. The cab was full of leaves and debris. Marcus's 2 crew members who'd followed in another truck stood back, arms crossed, waiting for the show. Marcus made a point of checking his watch. 60 minutes starts now, he said. William didn't acknowledge him. He was already moving toward the truck, his gait slow but purposeful, his sad eyes studying every detail. He set his tool bag down carefully. Then he did something that made Marcus frown. William stood completely still, his hand on the truck's hood, his eyes closed. He stood there for almost a full minute, not moving, not speaking, just standing, listening, feeling. Then he opened his eyes and went to work. His movements were different now. Slower than a young man's, yes, but absolutely certain. No hesitation, no wasted motion. He opened the hood, studied the engine with an intensity that made the watching mechanics shift uncomfortably. He pulled tools from his bag, tools they didn't quite recognize, and began working with a focus that was almost hypnotic. He didn't check the time, didn't look at Marcus or the others. His entire world had narrowed to that engine, to the machine that everyone else had declared dead. He worked on the fuel system first, his weathered hands moving with surprising dexterity. He bypassed the tank entirely, rigged a temporary gravity feed from a jerry can he'd had Marcus stop to fill. He cleaned the carburetor with a speed that suggested he could do it blindfolded. He checked the ignition system, replaced a corroded wire with one from his bag. He worked the starter manually, feeling for the resistance, for the telltale signs of what was seized and what was just stuck. Marcus stopped smiling. He moved closer, watching now with genuine curiosity. The old man knew what he was doing. More than knew. He moved like the truck was speaking to him, telling him exactly what it needed. 15 minutes had passed, then 20. William pulled the spark plugs, cleaned them, checked the gaps with practiced precision. He worked the engine manually, breaking free years of corrosion with patience and technique rather than brute force. His face never changed expression, remained sad and serious, but his hands moved with absolute confidence. 30 minutes. He was under the truck now, doing something to the starter. The young mechanics had stopped talking. They were all watching, transfixed by this old man in a red jacket who moved like he'd done this 10,000 times before, because he had. At 35 minutes, William emerged from under the truck. His jacket was dirty now, his hands black with grease. He made a few final adjustments, checked the fuel line one more time, then climbed into the cab. The seat groaned under his weight. He sat there for a moment, his hands on the steering wheel, and Marcus could have sworn the old man whispered something. A prayer, maybe, or a promise. Then William's hand moved to the ignition. The watching mechanics held their breath. Marcus checked his watch. 38 minutes. William turned the key. The starter groaned, clicked, groaned again. The engine turned over once, twice, coughed, died. Silence. One of the young mechanics exhaled, started to say something. William turned the key again. This time the engine caught. sputtered, coughed black smoke, and then, like a sleeping giant remembering its strength, it roared. The sound was massive, overwhelming, a deep throaty rumble that echoed off the armory walls. The Deuce and a half shook, settled, then smoothed out into a steady, powerful idle. 39 minutes. William sat in the cab, his hands still on the wheel, his expression unchanged, but something in his eyes, something that had been buried for years, flickered back to life. Marcus stood frozen. His mouth was open. His crew looked like they'd seen a ghost. The old man climbed down from the cab, slow and careful, and the engine kept running, strong, steady, alive. William picked up his tool bag, wiped his hands on a rag and walked toward Marcus. The younger man couldn't speak. He just stared at the running truck, at the impossible thing he'd just witnessed. William stopped in front of him. His voice was still soft, still hard to hear over the engine, but there was something in it now, something quiet and unbreakable. He said he didn't want the money. He said Marcus could keep his $1,000, but he wanted Marcus to understand something. This truck, these machines, they weren't just metal and bolts. They were built by people who understood what it meant when lives depended on them working. They were maintained by people who couldn't afford to fail, who didn't have backup or second chances. Age didn't erase that knowledge. It didn't erase those skills. It just made them quieter. Marcus found his voice. He asked who William was, where he'd learned to do that. The old man was already walking away, his tool bag over his shoulder. He paused, looked back. 23 years, he said. Marine Corps motor transport. 3 deployments. More trucks than he could count. He'd kept entire convoys moving through conditions that would have broken most people, and he'd done it because that's what you did. Because the mission mattered. Because the people depending on those vehicles mattered. He said Marcus was a good mechanic, he could see that. But good wasn't the same as tested, it wasn't the same as proven. Then William turned and continued walking, his red jacket bright against the grey morning. Marcus stood there watching him go. Then he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He called out, asked William to wait. He jogged to catch up, his crew following behind. When he reached the old man, Marcus was breathing hard, and it wasn't from the short run. He apologized, said he'd been arrogant, dismissive, disrespectful, said he'd judged William by his age and his appearance and he'd been completely wrong. He asked if William would consider coming by the garage sometimes, maybe teaching them some of what he knew. The old man studied him for a long moment. Then for the first time, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his sad face. He said, maybe. Maybe he would. Word spread fast. The property owner heard his truck was running and came out to see it himself. When he learned who'd done it, when he heard the story, he insisted on paying William. Not the $1,000 from the bet, but $5,000 for the work and the miracle. William tried to refuse, but the man wouldn't hear it. He said his father would have wanted it this way, would have wanted the truck brought back by someone who understood what it meant. William accepted, quietly, and donated half of it to the Veterans Hall that same day. Marcus kept his word. William started coming by the garage once or twice a week. He didn't say much, just watched, occasionally offered a quiet suggestion, or demonstrated a technique the younger mechanics had never seen. They learned to listen when he spoke, learned that his soft voice carried decades of hard-won knowledge. The dynamic in the garage changed. There was less arrogance now, more respect, more understanding that skill and wisdom weren't always loud, weren't always obvious, weren't always young. The Deuce and a half became a fixture at local veterans events. The property owner had it restored properly, kept it running, brought it out for parades and memorial services. And whenever someone asked about it, about how it had been brought back to life, the story was told, about an old man in a red jacket who'd been dismissed and underestimated, who'd proven that some knowledge runs deeper than age, some skills never fade, some worth can't be measured by appearance or years. William never sought attention for it. He remained quiet, serious, carrying his sadness like he always had. But something had shifted. He walked a little taller, spoke a little more often, let himself remember sometimes that he'd been good at something once, that maybe he still was. On the anniversary of that morning, Marcus had a small ceremony at his garage. He presented William with a plaque, thanked him in front of everyone for the lesson he'd taught them all. William accepted it with his usual quiet dignity, his sad eyes glistening slightly. He said something then that Marcus would never forget. He said the truck hadn't needed much. It had just needed someone who believed it still had life in it, who was willing to listen to what it was saying, who understood that abandoned didn't mean worthless. He said maybe people were like that too. Maybe we all just needed someone to believe we still had something to offer, to listen when we spoke, to see past the rust and the wear to what was still strong underneath.